Good morning.
Good morning, Chris.
How you doing, Marie?
Great.
Thanks for joining today. We have a big, long list of beautiful, wonderful attendees. Just from looking at it, I can definitely see that we have a lot of recidivists coming back from the past couple days and joining us again, and even some new faces, perhaps folks that didn't have the opportunity to hear our speakers on day one or participate in the workshops but want to get a summary. That's what today is for. I'm Chris Tucker, Chairman of the American Geographical Society, and with me is
Dr. Marie Price, President of the American Geographical Society.
Thanks for joining, Marie. So we thought today the best thing we could do is kind of give a Wavetops overview of what we thought we heard out of day one, some of the common themes that were recurring, and some of the kind of high points that we didn't see coming, and then go through day two with our workshops, which we are so pleased so many of you were able to help us with, bringing your insights and your experience around 25 different, really diverse set of kind of subtopics within GeoConvergence. It was very valuable to us, very valuable to the process, the NSF Convergence Accelerator process that we're here to support. So, in the interest of time, we want to try to keep this around an hour. We actually looked, after speaking with all of our different moderators from yesterday and just getting their Wavetops. Boy, is there a lot, more than enough for a great report, but we're out of respect for your time. We definitely don't want this to go 2 hours, but we may struggle keeping it at 1 hour. But you'll watch us, you'll hear us moving very quickly. So if we're moving too fast for you, apologies. This will be recorded and put on YouTube for posterity's sake, and you can always go back to it. But we're just going to launch into this and go from there. So any opening remarks, Marie, from that, just from your mind?
I think we just move on with the slides. There's plenty to talk about as we go forward. Thanks, Chris.
There we go. Faster is better. I'm stuck here in my basement full of maps, and Marie's literally sitting in an English garden. It's just gorgeous. So, okay. So next slide.
I guess that's convergence.
That's right. So GeoConvergence, again, this is just our shot at kind of some opening thoughts on what the GeoConvergence is. It's so big, so wide, so deep, and filled with so much diversity of experience that it's hard to capture in one definition. And we really asked you in the forms, we challenge you to maybe give us your own definition, and that's a standing offer. We would love for you to think about it based on the past 2 days and based on your own experience, and give us additional texture, maybe a completely different definition for the GeoConvergence. Next slide.
Chris, can I make a stab?
Yeah, please, Marie.
So in 2 words, I would call GeoConvergence action geography.
Geography.
One of the things that the last year or so under lockdown has allowed me to do, and maybe many of you, is to do a lot more reading. And one of the books I read was Jeffrey Sachs' The Age of Globalization, or The Ages of Globalization. And no surprise, the age we're in right now is the digital age. But the subtitle of that book, The Ages of Globalization, is Geography, Technology, and Institutions. And those 3 themes are kind of underscore what GeoConvergence is all about: the revolutionary technological changes, how we understand geophysical space and actual space in new and interesting, important, real-time ways. And then what are the institutions that, whether they're private sector, government, academic, that are going to help us move this forward? And I would say, in the idea of action geography, GeoConvergence has the potential to give us enormous amount of data and real-time information at multiple scales. But it's also the tricky part of data alone doesn't solve problems. We got to have action. We got to have policies. So that's why we really are so excited about the diverse group of people who have participated in this, that will lead us to ideas about how we make geoconvergence not just a dream, but a reality.
Amen. Amen. So for those of you who were with us yesterday, you learned how to use a QR code. So right now, feel free to use your cell phone and activate the camera. And when you point it at this QR code, a URL will come up. We thought it would be nice to do another word cloud. We're not going to do it right now, and you don't have to provide your input until towards the end of the event or when you time out and have to go to other things. But we would love for you to reflect on the past 2 days and our summary that we give you today, and just put in 2 words. I think you're only allowed to put in 2 words, but you can cheat by making them compound words if you want. And maybe it would be like a great way to get one last piece of collective feedback from all of you in visual form from listening to today and putting together an additional word cloud. And we'll make sure this comes up at the end again. Next slide. And another QR code. Hopefully it opens up a second browser instead of stomping on the other one. This is the form that was provided to everybody before the event and during the event. And just in case you feel like, hey, I had an idea that I wasn't able to get out during the sessions, or upon reflection, there were some things that just didn't get talked about by the speakers and the panelists. This is your opportunity to provide additional input around any of those sub themes, or even make up your own theme to provide us insights around problems, solutions, collaborations, and deliverables that you think could be valuable to this process for the Convergence Accelerator. Next slide. And last, before we get going, is lightning talks. So we got 16 of you in very short time frame before the event provided lightning talks that we thought really embodied kind of the GeoConvergence. But everyone on this call, everybody who signed up, everybody who participated in previous days are still invited to provide lightning talks. We'd love nothing more than to have hundreds of lightning talks representing all of your diverse background, experience, insights, worldviews. So please, if you feel inspired, take us up on this offer. We would love to serve as a platform for your thoughts. Next slide. Well, and there you go. Next slide. So on day one, next slide, we really could not have been more honored to be kicked off by someone who kind of embodies the GeoConvergence, Dr. Stacy Dixon, who's been nominated to be the #2 in the U.S. intelligence community, the principal deputy DNI, who currently serves as deputy director of NGA, who's been the head of IARPA, before that, head of research, or deputy head of research at NGA, a researcher at NRO and CIA. And always working around geoconvergence, whether from space or from the air or on the ground, in the cloud. We were honored to have Dr. Dixon kick us off. And, it's no surprise that the geoconvergence is played heavily in the national security scene. National security community historically has been one of the major investors in geo-type technologies going back centuries, literally. Certainly to the beginning of the American Republic, where the topographer of the United States sat on the horse next to George Washington surveying the battlefield. But this event really showed that those technologies have inspired, in many cases, use across many other domains. But also those domains in turn are now contributing back to the national security enterprise. So national security is just one of many voices that were represented in this dialogue over the past 2 days. Next slide. We really got kicked off in person by Dr. Nadine Alme, the CEO of the Open Geospatial Consortium. Next slide. And she really got us going with just this daunting review of the various sciences and technologies that have been brought together within the geoconvergence, with a challenge to take data to actionable information at scale, right? It's easy to do research and show the art of the possible. It's easy to show new capabilities and innovations that could potentially change our world. But many of these have actually kind of gotten a sound footing in industry and in government, in major NGO applications. But yet there's still a research frontier that shows so much possibility. So she focused on more sources of more data, new sensors, small sats, LiDAR, IoT, drones. She emphasized the importance of location and positional accuracy. It's not just the home of geodetic researchers in the academy or in government, but the future of GNSS and position via 5G, global grids, fine-grained positioning indoors and even underground is very promising, and not necessarily what you think of traditionally when you think of geo. It's only in recent years. Marie,
I was just going to add that both Stacy Dixon and Nadine Alme spent a lot of time talking about the X, Y, Z, and T coordinates. And certainly we know that the technology has allowed greater accuracy, spatial precision. But they also emphasize this idea of the telescoping of scale, and that we are not necessarily limited to a precise X and Y. We can zoom in and out, and focusing strictly on national boundaries, while very important, isn't really the best way of looking at many of these problems. And so the technological forefront, I think young people today, they are just used to pinching in and pitching out with their fingers when they see a map. They don't understand why a map would be static. And that's second nature to them. But I think still many of the ways we make decisions are from really a static maps with very hard boundaries. And so one of the really exciting things about bringing in time dimensions and then the shifting scalar is when you shift scale, things look different, and problems that are visible at one scale are invisible at others. So I think that's a really important part of this technological trend.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, everybody can read the slide, and the slides will be available for everybody. The videos online of the entire day. So I'll just kind of hit the wave tops. All these computing advancements, revolution in visualization and interaction with data, not just on your screen, but in augmented reality, virtual reality, mixed reality, introduction of real geodata to gaming engines. It's just kind of been an extraordinary transformation in a very short period of time over the past 5 or 10 years, where things have become kind of materially different in kind. AI, machine learning, big data analytics, things that may have started outside of geo, but have been cross-cutting capabilities absorbed into geo. In many ways, geo use cases have become some of the most instructive and challenging use cases to that non-geo community. Linked data analysis. And then in modeling and simulation, we'll talk about this several times over the course of the day. What does modeling and simulation mean? What are you modeling? What are you simulating? Those issues of scale and time that Marie just referenced are key, but also like the phenomenology itself, whether I'm doing modeling and simulation for the battlefield at extreme high resolution at an urban human scale, or if I'm doing economic modeling at a global scale, geo still plays a role, time still plays a role, but in very, very different ways, requiring different investments in order to advance the frontiers. Next slide. And just autofill this. So, Nadine then went to fields of application, pointing out that this is just a tiny subset, and it basically touches everything that happens on the planet. We had our own version of this in some of the announcement materials, but this just was true in every single discussion throughout the day, right? We have innovated and created new knowledge, maybe in one field of application, quickly to have it adopted by another, maybe in inexact and imperfect ways because it's not a direct match, but then new innovations that adapt it and modify it at the science level and technology level for a new domain then gets shared again. So this endless swirl of the geoconvergence has been a virtuous circle. But yet there are barriers that we need to recognize and invest to overcome collectively. Next slide. So she had a great set of panelists, and not to go over their presentations, but I mean, it's diverse, right? You have a Patrick Cozy who with Cesium is actually bringing high resolution, real geographic data, real precise, accurate geographic data into gaming engines. Like, we're going to have games that are of the real world for the first time, really, ever. because of the investments made in standards and innovation and research within and around the GeoConvergence. You have Mike Botts, who talked about sensors and actuators and processes working together, whether in the form of what we traditionally think of as like a sensor on a satellite or a thing in the Internet of Things or robots. Turns out our landscape is littered with these technologies that are capable of understanding our world in X, Y, Z, and T, and understanding the world in different scales. And I think those aren't the traditional parts of geo that people think about. And sometimes it's an alien language. And one of the challenges we have is creating a common language that all of us can harness as we kind of navigate the GeoConvergence ourselves. Sanjay, as a real thought leader in this space globally, really talked about the intersection of science and society, right? It's one thing to talk about the scientific frontiers, but how can you bridge it into society and back so it's not a one-way street? And Sarah Battersby, if you go to the next slide, Sarah's principal research scientist at Tableau. I often joke, Tableau is the biggest geo company in the world, bought by Salesforce for $16.5 billion a couple of years ago. But they're really a big data company, a data visualization company, a company that makes data available to regular people in a wide range of jobs across their enterprises. And I love this quote where, in a way, she's saying, geo has already converged, right? We need to be thinking about as geo professionals. And the convergence is the humble acknowledgement that we have expertise within the GeoConvergence in something that other people may not have that expertise, but they have their expertise in their own field of knowledge, their own field of practice. And we need to listen to each other really carefully, right? And often things are lost in translation. And we have a real opportunity to overcome those barriers, whether they're semantic barriers or conceptual barriers, to further fuel advancement in society.
Can I just underscore that point,
please.
Chris? I mean, one of the values of this workshop is that I'm sure everyone who paid attention, whether they came from the business side or government, learned something new. We need some humility in we have our sectors that we understand very well, and how we learn to listen to each other is just a skill I'm afraid that we're losing rather than improving over time. So if anything, to bring in these technologies, to be aware of the downsides. And even when we think about the GeoConvergence, we have to acknowledge that it's not an even process across the planet. There are some areas and localities and groups of people that are so much more tuned into this than others. And data varies by location, the quality of it, but certainly the density of it, something that Parag made clear in his discussion, which I think you're going to talk about next.
That's right. Next slide. There's Parag, Dr. Parag Khanna. We had an honor of having him tune in from Singapore in the middle of the night or the early morning. As one of the leading kind of geostrategy thinkers on the planet, next slide, I was really taken by his little breakdown. Oftentimes in geography, we talk about the physical geography, the biogeography, and the human geography, and how these come together. I actually liked his introduction of the functional geography. We have our natural world, whether it's the physical geography or biogeography. We have our humans. They're out there doing their thing. And one thing they do is draw lines on a map, these invisible lines on a map called borders that allow us to organize politically, organize our societies, organize our sovereignty. But then in so many messy and amazing ways, right, by building real world connections, using geospatial technologies, surveying the world, laying new railway, making all these various connections, we create this additional functional geography. Next slide.
Go
ahead, Marie.
No, I think that the idea of functional, whether it's functional regions or geography, how we're linked, this is one of Parag's great talents of bringing together data and visualizing it. And in his remarks, he made the comment that mobility is destiny. And mobility, he means, of course, the flow of goods and ideas and capital and people. And this is some of his visualizations, which are, you see some areas of the world are much more intensely linked than others, which is something as geographers we need to acknowledge, or as geo-convergencers we need to acknowledge. But I know Parag and I share a deep interest in human migration. And I would add, we're in an era right now where immobility is the reality for the majority of the people on the planet. Right. And we have to be humble about that. There are some very hypermobile, interconnected people and places, but then there are people that cannot move, and it's driven by politics and inequality. And so mobility may be destiny, it may be aspirational, but it's certainly not a given for probably most.
And it's not evenly distributed, right? So, absolutely. Geography is often about place. It's often about connectivity and connectography, as Parag likes to say. But both are unevenly distributed across our populations in terms of haves and have-nots. But I really liked his notion of programmable geography, right? We've entered an age, given the mobility, albeit uneven, that we enjoy. We have the ability to actually program the future geography of our planet within some constraints, which is kind of the opposite of, sometimes people talk about geography as destiny, and, geography is a determinate thing. And this really kind of puts the agency back in that. And to think about the role of geoconvergence tools in empowering that programming process. Like, if we're going to be deliberate about what the future of our planet looks like, we need to do it in X, Y, Z, and T with precision and accuracy, and with vision and forethought. So I really also liked one term. We're moving from sovereignty to administration, or what he said, sovereignty to stewardship. Mm-hmm. Right. We now have a moral obligation, as we understand our human impacts on our planet and our society, to serve as good stewards of all of these places on the planet, and how we move across the planet, reprogramming our planet. And I thought that was a very profound set of contributions. Marie? Yeah,
well, if I pick up on that, I think so often geography is seen as static, and the geography is destiny is that sort of view. If you live on the mountains or in a river valley, that sort of determines everything. But really, geography is about possibilities, possibilism. And to Parag's point, how there are choices that you have to make and shape the future geographies of the planet. And certainly GeoConvergence provides a potentially a sets of tools where we can be a lot smarter about this.
That's right. Next slide, please. So because Parag had to go to sleep, we had the honor of having the geographer of the United States moderate a panel. Next slide. That you can see on the next slide. Budu Badori from Oak Ridge, Greg Taff from WRI, and Dr. Susan Canny from the Mali Elephant Project. I mean, what an interesting swirl of folks working both the natural environment and the social environment. It was just a great conversation. I'll leave it at that. Watch the video if you missed it. I think it's the kind of conversation you can share in your classes. If you're a teacher, or certainly learn from as a practitioner. But again, wave tops. Let's keep going to the next slide. It is important for the Mali Elephant Project. I mean, just the sheer, oftentimes in GIS, we just think that's a data layer. Where does the data come from, right? The means and methods by which we actually characterize change over time of each of these phenomena, and then converge them into a common framework for understanding. Is kind of, it's blinding and phenomenal in its diversity. And so rather than thinking of it just in a reductionist sense, as at the tail end of the process, I have layers in my GIS, I thought it was a really robust conversation about all the different challenges of bringing these different kinds of data sets together so that you can actually integrate science with practice in some meaningful ways that both advance kind of human prosperity and while protecting the environment. Mm-hmm. Next slide. President Crow, when we talk about the implications of geoconvergence for academic disciplines, it's maybe useful to get that perspective from a president of a university. Professor Crow started, I think the trope that he started with was the quote from Cool Hand Luke, right? That, I think we have what is it? We have a problem in communication. What is it? Whatever it is. Where that is the story too often of our universities that are very siloed across disciplines, story of our governments, where the agencies have their own authorities and missions that they may not be able to collaborate on. And it was President Crow's perspective, that the geoconvergence could play a really meaningful role in bringing down those barriers and allowing us to bring science to action. That you could bring science to policymakers, bring science to citizens, make the academy failure to communicate. Thanks for the post. What we have here is the failure to communicate. So the geoconvergence is an opportunity to actually overcome that failure to communicate. And next slide. I would encourage you to listen. If you're a university administrator, listen to this particular talk. And in the end, President Crow ended with geoconvergence could be more timely, right? This is a moment in time we have right here. What geoconvergence offers us is a platform which could be beyond transformational within the academy and beyond. Marie, you had a comment?
Yeah. He was magnificent and so articulate, and was ability to look at the big picture from the seat of a major Research One university. But I also liked, he saw geoconvergence as the great scientific undertaking of our time. Likening it to a moonshot in trying to integrate this real time, but also temporal X, Y, and Z data. And that ability to communicate not just the physicality of our planet, but how we as humans are changing it. And that really puts us in the drive. That's an important story. And again, there are lots of ways to communicate it, but geoconvergence certainly might provide those new tools that could change people's minds.
That's right. Next slide. So since President Crow had to go back and run a university, Dr. Bob Chen from Columbia University Season within the Earth Institute was kind enough to moderate a panel. Next slide. With some really phenomenal folks. And I mean, it's not often that you get somebody working wildlife criminology and somebody working at Harvard Medical School and somebody working, kind of innovation within international affairs and humanitarian assistance, disaster response on the same panel as somebody that runs a major NASA data center, all talking a similar language. I really encourage you to listen to this if you're in the academy or if you're struggling to interface with the academy through the geoconvergence, because I think these people's thought leadership represents a real interesting and useful way of going about it. Next slide. In particular, I was struck by these two quotes. Dr. Gore, who isn't a geographer, who now resides in the geography department after a long circuitous route through many different disciplines. She really saw, team science and interdisciplinary thinking with geography as the Rosetta Stone for kind of decoding all of these very complex challenges that she faces and that we face as a society. And then Dr. D. Jordan, who's at Harvard Medical School, reflecting on the pandemic, if we had geoconvergence centers, I kind of love that idea. I'm not sure where they'd be or who would run them and how they'd be funded. But if we had geoconvergence centers that existed, before the pandemic, can you imagine what that would have looked like, right? How would the global pandemic have unfolded differently if we could have monitored and understood and projected things better and differently? Next slide. Tony Frazier, captain of industry. The fact that he even took time out of his day when his job is to make enormous amounts of money and move his stock ticker northward while supporting public missions and private customers was a real coup for us. Next slide. Tony had a couple just visuals, since he lived in DC area. this is kind of amazing data in and of itself. A quarter century of change that you can understand at very fine grain level across the DC area, and know when was kind of the last material change at that pixel at that moment in time. But the journey that we're on, that we've been on, next slide, has taken us to a place where the level of granularity that we can understand our cities in, based on the geoconvergence, based on data from space, based on AI, ML, based on all of these advanced processing chains that we only have because of decades of investment in academic photogrammetry, et cetera, is kind of astounded. And you take that resolution, if you go to this resolution and you start dealing with change over time, it gives you a very different way of adding value to industry, adding value to government missions. And it's kind of the tip of the spear where you see why is photogrammetry valuable? And all you have to do is point at this screen and say, this is why academic photogrammetry is valuable, right? This is what it's resulted in after decades of investment.
I think this contribution, when people think we're in the digital age, immediately people think about their smartphones and what they're able to do with them, and their reliance on computers and technology. But from geoconvergence, it is the proliferation of remotely sensed data. I've been in this business and educating for over 30 years, and I remember as a graduate student having to buy a Landsat image, one image that cost hundreds of dollars. And now people are totally normalized. Of course, you can hear about a place and look at it in Google Earth, and there has went from real inaccessibility to much greater accessibility. And maybe, if anything, we're buried in a volume of data that we will never process unless we figure out, new algorithms to review it all. But to me, this is really the core technological transformation that has given us this ability to talk about X, Y, Z, and T.
That's great. Next slide. So Tony didn't leave us with this, but I just think it's worth getting the sense of the scale, right? These things don't just happen because somebody had a good idea, right? Oftentimes it's taking the good idea into reality that is exceedingly hard and exceedingly expensive. So part of this transformation in remote sensing is because 25 billion was invested in space startup companies just in the past 5 years, right? 3.3 billion indirectly invested in Earth observation satellites. It's resulted in 597 commercial remote sensing satellites in orbit, which is like a ridiculous concept in and of itself, with 4,500 plus planned, right? So the world is changing. The nature of those sensors, the phenomenologies they support are changing, adding radio frequency mapping, methane emissions mapping, hyperspectral imaging commercially done at unbelievable resolutions. So we have a lot of things getting ready to happen due to investment by industry, but it must be matched by investment in the public sector that gracefully connects the two. Otherwise, there are no pipelines for talent. There is no pipeline of new fundamental insights that can continue to fuel all of that industrial innovation. Next slide. But because Tony had to go off and run a company, AGS counselor Dean Wise was willing to step in. As I pointed out yesterday, I love Dean. Dean is my heavy industry guy. I've never met somebody who's worked, railroads and mining and utilities and like every heavy industry there is, and a geographer to boot, right? And everything he thinks of is geographic. So it was a really interesting moderation of our panel. Next slide, which we had two folks, Dr. Ben Tuttle, AGS fellow, and I'm chief technology officer of Arturo AI, which is a new startup receiving enormous amounts of private sector investment because they're revolutionizing how the insurance companies understand the properties that they're underwriting. They're revolutionizing how the finance community can think about these fixed assets and sense them and characterize them in ways that are reliable, that financial fiduciaries can depend on. And what couldn't be more different than Janine Jung, who they sold, her last company got sold to Facebook, and now she works at Snapchat doing location augmented reality. I mean, my teenage daughters use Snapchat and don't underwrite real estate, right? And somehow this conversation between these three folks was really inspiring because the same sets of tools right? That, that they're going to use for very different things. Ben's like, hey, you just bought that company, Pixelate Earth, and I'd like to talk to you about the value that can bring to my, insurance underwriting business. So I thought that was just, manifestly demonstrated kind of the power of the geoconvergence, when even across very diverse verticals in industry, you see collaborations kind of popping up on the screen. Next slide. And then our last panel, led by Miss Denise McKenzie, who is currently chair of the Association for Geographic Information in the UK, but so much more. Again, go onto our website and read these bios. If you're just thinking, oh, they were smart, like, read their bios. They're incredible people. And Denise her background is amazing across the world of geo. Next slide. She always has great slides. A dude with a drone, why does this matter to you? It's a great question. Is that what I want to buy for my kid for Christmas? That's how a lot of us think about it. But these introduce fundamental questions to us as a society. Next slide. These kinds of technologies, not just drones, but the geoconvergence has demonstrated in your cell phones, in the Internet of Things, across all these devices that we're littering across our planet. Issues of privacy, issues of ethics, responsibility, transparency, trust, and accountability are all tied to these. And these are kind of the major principles that we use to govern our society, to shape how humans interact, how our governments shape our futures. And she went into that. Next slide. She had a great panel of I thought a pretty diverse set of worldviews. We have a Jesuit priest who's a university professor who works in health policy, but yet is a thought leader in the ethical implications of geospatial tech within the geoconvergence. Mr. Andrew Zoli, who is vice president for impact initiatives at a satellite company, right? When you have the power in your hands to image the Earth once a day, you have a great responsibility to use it to do good and to not do harm, right? And maybe also do well for yourself. That's what a business is there to do. And then Miss Stacy Gray, as a lawyer, senior counsel at the Future Privacy Forum. I could try to go through this discussion, but I would just encourage you to share it with everybody, because we have a company that actually has a built-in ethics board that is building ethics policies with ethics reviews, because they understand the power of the geoconvergence is something they have a responsibility to deal with proactively. And the question is, what other universities and or companies and institutions could and should be doing the same thing? Marie?
So this is an area that the American Geographical Society cares deeply about. We have the Ethical Geo Initiative, which has been very active for the last couple of years. Moreover, during the pandemic, we really zeroed in on location tech and how it could contribute or really not be used in fighting the pandemic. What we've learned from this is that there is enormous public weariness and wariness of what this means to daily lives and privacy, from all types of peoples, from groups that are particularly vulnerable to everyday kind of middle class, middle-aged citizens. And so there's an enormous amount of work that has to be done in the ethics of how this technology is transparent, but sometimes has to be protective, who has access to it. And this was a great conversation, and one that if you go to look at our Ethical Geo page, you'll be able to dive deeply into this topic.
Great. And as the guy that was the moderator, the day 2 moderator on the ethics track, I'll have a little more to say about that. But please do check out ethicalgeo.org. You can find the work of Father Rozier and all of our other Ethical Geo fellows. And a lot of it's a very active space. If you have any interest in being a contributor or just kind of a keen follower to bring it and introduce it into your own organization, we can talk about that. The Locust Charter is one slide that I must have pulled, is one of our efforts to build an international charter guidelines for how to use location and geospatial technology and data responsibly. So next slide. Then we had day 2. I just spent 35 minutes talking about day 1. Day 2 is exhausting, guys. So, I was up to like 3 a.m. just trying to put together kind of 20 minutes of conversations with my fellow moderators. Just some fascinating things came out of it, and not necessarily obvious things. So each one of our moderators owned a track. So for instance, we'll go to the first one. Next slide. And in all the tracks, we asked everybody to talk about what problems are hampering the geoconvergence in that area, what solutions they might have observed that if we embrace the solutions, it could accelerate the geoconvergence and get the good things out of it faster, what collaborations might be there latently that could, if with some investment or even just some brokering of relationships, could really transform and advance geoconvergence, and what deliverables, right? If you were put under a grant, if you were given a shot, what deliverables could be created, maybe not by you, but somebody you know, that could really help advance the frontiers of knowledge and practice within the geoconvergence. Next slide. So the first session was high tech. I wish I had his picture, but I was up till 3 a.m. just doing this stuff. So this was Dr. Josh Campbell, AGS counselor who did yeoman's work in shepherding these conversations. Each one of these conversations had different sets of people. I mean, there was some overlap, but different people showed up every hour for him to referee. One thing he noted was, it was interesting, in all of these topics, we had a lot of academics participating, but folks from government industry also. And it was interesting that training came up over and over and over, which kind of betrayed a sense that somehow, like, we may not have all the skills as individuals to fully harness the power of these new areas of high tech that are crossing over into the geoconvergence, that are superpowering the geoconvergence. And if we're gonna accelerate the geoconvergence, maybe we need some real training. Maybe we need to find a way to bring cloud computing, machine learning, artificial intelligence, computer vision, autonomy, robotics, Internet of Things, and modeling simulation into the heart of the geoconvergence, when many of us may not have started our careers by using these things. One of the interesting observations I thought was, in modeling and simulation, there was a sense that industry is moving so fast. Like, how could NSF, really affect it, right? How could it invest in ways that help catalyze further advances if industry gets too far ahead? But also there was some interesting discussion. I think Barry Tilton and Karen Kemp, represented in that discussion 2 very different kinds of modeling and simulation, and made you recognize that there's not one modeling and simulation community. There's many different communities harnessing the power of modeling and simulation who need the geoconvergence to work for them. But as Marie said, they may function at very different scales. And if I'm doing one thing for like smart city management and modeling at urban high resolution scale, that's fundamentally different than understanding kind of economic modeling at a regional or national or global scale, even though both require the geo and they both require time. So I think, we really need to dig deep on what modeling simulation means. Marie?
It's just changing so quickly, and maybe it's the private sector that's leading, but certainly what you see in universities is this is not the domain of just computer science or geography or economics or fill in the physics. I mean, there are cross disciplines. People have to know about machine learning and programming and the Internet of Things, maybe more on the engineering side, but it affects us all. I think you'll see a lot more convergence, disciplines like data science emerging. How do we manage large amounts of different kinds of information, which would have seemed kind of odd 15 years ago, but now seems very normal.
That's right. That's right. And to that, AIML, in that discussion, wide-ranging discussion, but, one interesting discussion came out of kind of concerns around reproducibility, right? if I'm using AI and ML over and over and over, how do I know that I'm going to get reproducible science? And there's a new additional kind of complementary set of technologies, kind of GitHub-like ledger infrastructures that can help track data provenance over ever-changing data, right? So, there's a lot of kind of hairy situations, hairy issues that need to be unwound that require real research. There are real problems that require real solutions before we can unleash the full power of AI, ML, CV into the geoconvergence. The autonomy conversation, we only had so much time. This particular autonomy conversation really focused on autonomous vehicles, particularly with David Lee in the conversation. Some questions around, like, is that autonomous vehicle autonomy model something that is more generally applicable to other areas where we know we need autonomy or we aspire to have autonomy? Or are they fundamentally different? Like, what lessons are actually transferable from cars to other forms of autonomy? This also made Dr. Campbell, as moderator, kind of reflect on Dr. Mike Botts' comments from day one around, everything on our planet that we're building are built of sensors, processes, and actuators. Are we thinking about autonomy correctly? Or do we need to disaggregate it into, more fundamental primitives that are arranged into various kind of autonomous processes across sensors, things, and robots? The IoT discussion was also interesting. But part of this discussion focused really on environmental monitoring, which took the conversation, environmental monitoring through like a geoconvergence perspective, which really brought the discussion to the idea that community engagement, working with local stakeholders, could somehow work to get us toward, an agreed upon desired end state, right? Like, what are the goals, right? Why are we just deploying technology and deploying science and making observations? Like, what is actually useful to people in that local area? What are the phenomena they're actually dealing with? But what's interesting is perhaps there's many different kind of narrow fields of applications within the Internet of Things. Each has their own kind of practical implications, but also it may kind of impact, there may be opportunities to standardize across and build kind of a body of knowledge, but it also may get very fractured across different fields of applications. And it's unclear, how it can be reapplied. If only data that meets certain thresholds is forwarded for archiving from a particular project, will that create a longitudinal data set that's more broadly usable, for other purposes across a geography? Or is it going to be trapped in a narrow stovepipe? So a lot of big questions, lots of problems, interesting solutions, fertile ground for collaborations, and interesting potential for real world deliverables. Next slide. Can you go back one? Oh, no, that was it. And that's our word cloud. There's word clouds. You can see this just came out of the MLCV discussion, and there's many more. So those will be in the final report. Next. So the next one was around geotech as opposed to high tech. These are things that we in the geo community are a bit more familiar with, the core of our business historically. One of the observations is that the discussions around sensor tech and satellites was kind of less enthusiastic, less dynamic than some of the other conversations, to some extent, maybe because it's further away from the actual application, right? There are definitely people that are interested in the next generation of satellites and what phenomenologies they have, what are their resolutions, what are their revisit rates, and things like that. What are new sensor technologies that may be used outside of space? But it was really the conversation about remote sensing where there was a lot of enthusiasm and interest. Not just around the data and technology, there was interest in the social issues and the range of use cases that remote sensing could address, the very, very wide range of use cases they could address. And not just space-based remote sensing. And maybe that's why kind of the enthusiasm was bigger, right? Remote sensing involves, space, air, mobile, terrestrial remote, all these in situ kind of sensing methods that can ground truth what you're getting remotely. So, I think that was the source of a lot of the enthusiasm, and maybe, that's going to be an anchor point within the geoconvergence going forward. Another very enthusiastic conversation was around digital twins. How could disparate data sets and sets of X, Y, Z, and T observations be used to develop digital twins? But interestingly, kind of the term digital twin seemed to not mean the same thing to everyone, right? People are trying to twin different parts of the world. There's no one twin of the entire world. You had folks with perspectives ranging everything from like archaeology to using digital twins in education about your local environment. And those are, I wouldn't call them narrow conceptions, but they're very specific conceptions of building a digital twin that's useful for that purpose. And this really suggests some fertile ground for researching and implementing digital twins within the GeoConvergence for a wide range of different fields of application, raising unique challenges in terms of data completeness, reproducibility of results, and particularly as, you know, we're twinning things that continue to change. So not only does our knowledge, our observations about the twin improve over time, but then the thing you're twinning is changing over time. So it really creates some complex issues around change over time as those things you're twinning evolve and mature, while your digital twins evolve and mature. That was a bunch of word salad. I apologize for that, but you get my point. And then the last topic in this track was GPS. I think this conversation could have gone a bunch of different ways, but one thing I found interesting was apparently there was a real focus on, you know, surveying and conducting censuses and, you know, using GPS to say, here is where these people live and here's where their property lines are. And apparently, you know, an interesting area of commonality between like the US and the developing world, right, is that the US Census has many of the same kinds of issues as in the developing world, where some Americans, you know, don't trust the government. You know, they trust the government as little as a citizen in Dar es Salaam may trust theirs. You know, why are you on my property? Why are you surveying this? Who are you? Why are you counting me? And so while something very technical and I mean requires rockets and orbital mechanics and quantum physics to make this thing run, but it's trust that actually makes it work. And so the issue of trust and how to build trust around the technologies, around public understanding and partnership and collaborations turned out to be kind of a surprising winner in that conversation. The next workshop, and then these are just cut and paste out of the Slido. Many of these are going to be racked and stacked. We'll go from phrases to full sentences and hopefully complete thoughts. This is where I'd ask you, if you feel like you had a good idea on the fly during the Slido session, feel free to fill out those forms that we gave you the QR code for and put a complete thought down. I know oftentimes my best ideas happen when I least expect them to. So if you had some really good ideas, we'd love the complete thought instead of just kind of a three word phrase. Next slide. And spatiotemporal data, I will say temporal was a winner. It wasn't just about geography. Time was a recurring theme everywhere. And it certainly was in these discussions also. So the next session was run by Dr. Sophia Liu, who is at the U.S. Geological Survey, doing work at Health and Human Services these days. She is a rock star. Get to know her if you haven't already. And she led 5 discussions around climate change, conservation, natural habitats, public health, oceans, and disaster mitigation. There was an interesting commonality observed across climate change, disaster management, and conservation that seemed to raise similar points. How do we reduce duplicative efforts, right? These are vast geographies and everybody's grappling with these big, hard issues and investing, you know, on top of each other. So how do we reduce duplicative efforts? How do we battle insufficient funding? Maybe they are kind of, you know, those balance, not balance each other out, but magnify each other, right? There's limited funding, but yet we're being duplicative in what we do. The challenges of different international perspectives on these global issues often hamper kind of progress by, because there's different sets of policies, even geopolitical conflict over these issues that make them difficult to address in a comprehensive global manner. So it's much more of a piecemeal, nation by nation or NGO by NGO. The value of crowdsourcing and tackling these massive issues that often span massive geographies was a recurring theme. The potential for citizen science to contribute to these big issues was a recurring theme. The opportunity to harness social media and publicly generated content in your analysis was a big theme. And the role of trust when you're in the business of finding and leveraging, the best possible data out there, a wide variety of sources to do things like forecasting and time casting, anticipating and predicting. How do you trust that you've got good data? How do you trust that that data has been managed well? You actually have to build relationships of trust, and to know the data is credible. You need to know that the people are credible and the organizations are credible, their methods are credible, and how to communicate that within the GeoConvergence is a major issue. But those commonalities showed up over and over and over in climate change conservation and disaster mitigation. Not that they didn't show up in the others too.
Can I do a follow-up point about crowdsourcing and citizen science? This is an area of great innovation, especially the various open source frameworks. And I'd like to give a shout out to Youth Mappers, which is an organization that AGS supports and collaborates with. It was initially funded with a grant and still funded by the USAID. But Youth Mappers are college students in 60, 70 countries and several 300 universities who are mapping localities, especially in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Latin America, and getting information onto OpenStreetMap and using it to affect local policies. And, when you think about the history of mapping, which for most of human history, maps were very controlled and only few people had access to them. And one of the revolutionary changes are tools in the hands of everyday people. And the advantage of Youth Mappers is it's teaching through peer mentoring, college students teaching other college students how to do this and respond to crises, whether it's a typhoon or fires or flooding. And so if you don't know about Youth Mappers and you're on the academic side of things, you should, and you could even form a chapter in your own university. It's across disciplines. It's not just geographers for sure, but I think it speaks to the potential of building trust when people understand how the data are gathered and then can see it and use it. I think that helps make the case that there's value in this information and it can impact local lives.
Great. A couple more comments on this track, and they're kind of here and there. One interesting commonality across those three in particular was that it was observed that the typical silos within academia and even within government agencies, the balkanization between different agencies, often can quickly erode in the face of acute emergencies, acute crises that you often hear about, in the world of climate change, conservation, disaster mitigation, and also public health. Even parts of oceans, whether it's a tsunami or it's a violent storm, bleeds into the world of disaster mitigation or conservation. But it's these kind of crises that actually create this really interesting opportunity for the GeoConvergence, where they can only really be solved if everyone works together. And it's the GeoConvergent technologies that create that lingua franca of X, Y, Z, and T, and how we understand kind of the world in a common frame. Another comment that I thought was interesting, or Sophia was struck by, was one comment when addressing these issues. The quote was, "Research is slow," which I'm not sure if that came from an academic or if that came from somebody in industry, but the observation was that there was this kind of discussion that followed of how innovation and moving the needle, if you will, seem to occur when you see the GeoConvergence converging around these themes. It gives some hope that the investment in accelerating GeoConvergence could help advance research while accelerating the transition of the fruits of this research into practice. So, I mean, there's a lot of kind of recursive meta level thinking in that whole comment there. But it seems like the GeoConvergence could help advance research, accelerate research, and accelerate the transition of research into practice. And lastly, ethics, topic of bias within data collection and the importance of community inclusion, or even community-driven collection came up time and time again in these discussions. Which would be no surprise given their connection to the well-being of humans and natural world. And I want to underscore what Marie said. Youth Mappers is a great example of on-the-ground organizations, people who live in a place that are invested in that place. So there's less kind of humanitarian tourism or research tourism where, those of us from the developed world are showing up, with our projects. There's an opportunity to actually bring the power of the GeoConvergence, the power of scientific inquiry to actually supercharge the on-the-ground needs of people, whether it's through Youth Mappers or other organizations that are on the ground. That's something that came out time and time again. In the next session, if you go to the next slide. Oh, well, we have some word cloud here, word cloud, next slide. Okay, and two more. So if you give me about 15 more minutes, I think I can get us to through this part, and then we'll try to wrap it up quickly. Thank you for paying attention. So ethics. I had the honor and the pleasure to manage this discussion. The first one, ethical consideration, is where I screwed up all the AV, and for the first 15 minutes of the session, it was a hot mess, and I failed to take good notes, and I lost all the Slido. But there was a really good conversation for which I do have some notes. When Doug Richardson actually raised a great point about kind of, I'm not sure I get his words right, I need to rewatch the video, but about the lack of good guidance for academics to rely on as they design their own geoconvergence related fieldwork around the world. There's kind of this void is a real issue that impedes the development of ethical research projects. There's great field work that's been done. There's great partnerships that have been built on the ground. They're not obvious how to do, and kind of these best practices kind of need to be bottled and shared in some useful way. It could be something NSF invests in because it's a particular kind of research, right? And how you treat those humans ethically in your research matters. Marie?
And I add that, from the academic setting, going through institutional review boards and human subject review, that set of principles and guidelines is really shaped by the biomedical world and how you treat individuals as subjects and their physical bodies, blood, tissue, that sort of thing. And I don't think IRBs have really thought about space in a meaningful way and the kinds of data that are collected, whether it's through drones or high resolution satellite imagery, and how it's stored, what are the confidentiality concerns. So this is an area where I think GeoConvergence and NSF could be very helpful in maybe shaping what these parameters should be, because it's not thought about in the ways that it need to be.
Right. And, Doug, in his own research and the work he did with the AAG over many years, has actually generated some great templates, some great models. And other institutions have also, right? So how can we bring those together and bring those designs together, those collaboration agreements from previous successful projects that were widely deemed to be ethically implemented to be collected and published as a community resource? I thought that was a really great point from that first session.
I would just add, I think the Locust Charter speaks to that too, how we should try to set some international standards, and it's just getting going, but that's another way of zeroing in on where the ethical concerns are.
Great point. Great point. The next session on diversity and inclusion, there were two major threads in that discussion. One was kind of the oft recited concern, and it's oft recited because it's often true that there is lots of lip service paid to diversity and inclusion and often little action. I mean, that's the truism. We've all experienced it. I think we know it, even when we know good actors and good institutions that have led the way. While we all know that our institutions have a long way to go on diversity, equity, and inclusion, there's also some good recommendations on how the research plan development process and the proposal review process could better incorporate more diverse voices. So we had a lot of great input on that, particularly about getting input from those communities that are most likely to be impacted by the research, right? And it's not just adding one person necessarily to the review board. Is this good for your community or not? None of us like to have to be the sole voice representing our community. This kind of goes beyond, as Marie said, this kind of standard human subject review process, seeking where we need to seek to better represent the interests and the aims of these communities, and even to potentially build relationships that can enlist their support in collecting more inclusive and representative data. So I think that was a great topic. Also, topic that came up here was the commonly recognized challenge of diversity and inclusion in those receiving grants, right? Too often the grants are given to those who got grants before, right? It's kind of this virtuous cycle for some and a vicious cycle for others. And I thought some really interesting observations that the GeoConvergence offers some really unique opportunities that other fields may not have available to them, where you have opportunities to demonstrate your expertise, your capability, and your insights by participating in things like the open source geospatial software development community, or the open source geospatial data collection and curation communities that are out there, where historically underrepresented and disadvantaged communities are empowered to harness these widely available tools to kind of show, right, to proactively show their expertise and creativity. There's on-ramps, there's supportive communities to bring them in there. And also provides publicly available metrics. Like in those communities, who's the best, who worked the hardest, who is the most accurate. And I think it provides really interesting opportunities that I think our institutions supporting research need to look to reward, to use those as cues for who should be eligible for funding. And anyways, it was kind of a pathway to somehow create a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive research selection process.
Mm.
Go ahead, Marie.
I was just thinking that it came up somewhat in this workshop, but also in a workshop we ran last summer looking at location tech, was the idea that not all data should be permanently archived. And especially when you're dealing with very personal data and people sharing information about their location, say during a pandemic. And I think that is another area of concern. Yes, we want to archive data because we want to understand change over time, but there needs to be some curation. And with the mind in mind of marginalized or vulnerable groups, that there has to be maybe some firewalls, or deciding that some data doesn't get stored, it gets dumped after so many days or weeks, whatever the necessary time frame is.
Absolutely, and that's a great transition into the discussion around vulnerable and marginalized groups. This issue, this session kind of addressed many of the same issues from the previous sessions, but really from the viewpoint of vulnerable and marginalized groups, coming to kind of everybody in the group really came to the collective conclusion that the GeoConvergence could only really be ethical if it kind of centered its work on the most vulnerable and marginalized when looking at impacts of certain phenomena, right? Too often the GeoConvergence has looked at kind of majority cases, those big phenomena that impact the world, treating everybody else as like an edge case, an outlier, a statistical outlier. And that just magnifies the vulnerability and the marginalization of already vulnerable and marginalized groups. So it really seems that there are, great benefits that this affords us, the majority of us, right? If we focus on the vulnerable and the marginalized, because unfortunately, often they kind of serve as a canary in the coal mine. They're the first to be impacted by something bad that's going on. And often the majority are blind to the fact that it could come to impact a significant portion of the majority. So it's kind of as a strategy, not just because it's a good thing to do, to really pay attention to the vulnerable and marginalized groups, but it's good for everybody if we kind of anchor the GeoConvergence in the concerns of vulnerable and marginalized groups. And I thought that was kind of an insight that I thought was useful. And then lastly, the discussion of social equity and environmental justice. I thought this conversation surfaced some really great concepts that really highlighted the uniqueness and the power of geoconvergence approaches to research and innovation. This discussion, I think, properly recognized the role and power, the role of power in the production of geospatial data. A great quote from the Slido was, "Rich people create more data." Right? And they create data that's useful to them. It's data that's for their purposes. And the poor people, I mean, forgive the kind of stark differentiation here, but poor people produce less data and have less access to good data and often lack the tools and capacity to harness such data for their own advancement, right? To become less marginalized, to have more equity. So also, somebody talked about historic boundaries, like the boundaries, not just boundaries from history, but the boundaries that we traditionally use to slice and dice our data and think about the groups being affected, that are used in the analysis by our everyday institutions and businesses, often reinforce these power dynamics, right? They reinforce the sovereignty of those already in power, whether the boundaries are based in a census or political boundaries or property boundaries or the like. It kind of the same thing rings true. And the geoconvergence, properly and ethically implemented, has the opportunity to use the power of X, Y, Z, and T to properly value our valuable natural resources, to properly account for the total costs incurred by various actions toward our environment and various populations. There were some fascinating proposals about potential collaborations around indigenous populations, tribal groups, who happen to live in interesting places where there's complex borders, right? They're not accounted for properly because they're at the intersection of these traditional powered borders, but also often at the intersection of natural boundaries that confuse things even further, that can have negative impacts, like floods and droughts, etc. So it seemed that using geoconvergence approaches to better anticipate adverse environmental impacts and even to address complex opportunities for restitution for historic injustice, there's just some fascinating discussion. I encourage all of you to kind of think further about that. Next slide. And then our last workshop, word cloud, keep going. These are great words: localization, exploitation, words that you don't really think about in the realm of like GPS and remote sensing. Like lots of very important geographic concepts were grappled with in these sessions. I think were great. And then the last session that was run by AGS fellow Tom Fitzwater from the U.S. Census. He covered national security, transportation, mobility, barriers to collaboration, public policy, smart cities. I actually covered labor and the future of work because not everything was clean here, but I'm going to talk about it here. Barriers to collaboration was kind of one of the big winners. Tom kind of thought that this session was a surprise topic in terms of the level of engagement. There was a lot of discussion about how difficult it is for academics to work with each other across disciplinary stovepipes, to work with government agencies around their own missions and data sets, and to work with industry. There was particular discussion about the misalignment of academic incentives for collaboration, and I've kind of witnessed that myself within the geoconvergence, and something we really need to pay attention to. This seems particularly acute around the geoconvergence, given the need to share geospatial data at scale, to compute on it at scale, and to leverage it across so many different disciplines and fields of practice. You almost wish like the geoconvergence was free for the academy and all the resources were just available because everybody's burned up, negotiating another data license or getting another piece of software. And we don't all have access to the same tools and data. National security was less of a winner, partially because it was felt that national security community already was kind of well financed in terms of its research, but there was a real feeling that the NSF geoconvergence community, if you will, could really help fill in the cracks and provide kind of feeders of talent and build bridges to various components in the DoD around the geoconvergence, given the centrality that Geo has to national security enterprises, operations, and analysis. Public policy was less of a winner. Though it was clear that, but probably because just time of day and fatigue. I'll tell you, if you were in these sessions yesterday, 5 hours of sessions is hard. It was very clear that there's a consistent feeling that the fruits of geoconvergence research and innovation could profoundly impact public sector decision making. So I think there's a lot more work to suss that out and understand how that can be done. There was a real commonality across transport mobility and smart cities. Partially, it seems because these are things you have to build and run and service a community with them, right? So they receive a particular kind of attention. There was discussion around issues of data licensing, governance, ethical use, interoperability, standards, and the discoverability of data that applied to both. Perhaps because, these topics were really about successfully running a complex enterprise, services citizens and their representatives. One term that I was struck by that Tom passed along was around smart cities, right? It's not about just building smart cities with sensors and actuators and robots and things. It's really about building a city that meets the needs of the city and its population intelligently. And that kind of reverses the equation a little bit. And I found that very useful and compelling. So geoconvergence isn't just instrumentalism to be applied to different challenges, but a value-based goal can inspire a better geoconvergence. And that's something that should be a challenge to all of us. And then lastly, the future of work, which is something I actually dealt with in my panel. There was a lot of interesting discussion there about, we've all been working from home for a year and change. The geography of how we get work done is fundamentally different, but it's actually given a breather for communities to think through what should be the future geographic layout of the future of work. Issues around geo-design, ethical design of our cities, how we live, became an issue, but also how do we work in virtual geographic space? And there's all these interesting mashups of not just getting on a Zoom and meeting with people, but knowing where those people are, so that in our limited time together, we can collaborate in local settings. So anyways, I thought the future of work conversation is very important and requires a lot more attention. Next slide. So next slide, sorry. These are just some outtakes. So problems, solutions, collaborations, and deliverables. That's really what we had everybody focus on. I hate to say it, but we've got, many forms filled out that we're going to have to sift through. I was up to like 3:30 in the morning just getting today. So we're really focused on this. We encourage you very much to fill out those forms so we can get your ideas. The more specific the collaborations, the more specific the deliverables, even better. But we had a lot of these impressionistic, like, wouldn't it be amazing if groups like this dealt with groups like that for the following reason? And that's also very useful input. So I just want to kind of point that out. Next slide. Oh, wow. This is what Katie, is this what people have been doing today?
Yes.
Ooh, interdisciplinary, collaboration, innovation, action, geography, open innovation, free use, problem solving, geo results, geo-driven, integration, emergent linkages, applied geography, spatio-temporal, accessibility, geoconvergence is even in there, leveraging innovation, effective decisions, understanding, drive policy, heterogeneous, results-driven. This is great. Thank you, everybody. I wasn't even, right. I forgot this is going to pop up later.
We're getting real-time answers to your question, Chris. I'd like to jump in a little bit about both the problems and the solutions, and maybe you can, add and get other feedback. To me, listening to this, I saw that problems of trust kept coming up in almost all the workshops, and society trusting this information, training, and that's something I think on the academic side is going to be increasingly important and probably start earlier and earlier.
You can't have education anymore without training, right? I mean, it's kind of like you have to do, but it's not an either or anymore. It's not, I'm going to get trained instead of educated. Like, you got to do both to have the right tools to harness the power of your education, right?
And I think that the point of going to Sophia, research and understanding happens slowly, but the technology is changing quickly. And we have these, encounters of one way of understanding the world, and all of a sudden brand new technology takes us in new directions. So those, just broadly speaking, were the problems. I think in the solutions, we always want more data and more information, but data that's oriented towards identifying a problem and then coming up with solutions, that's the gold standard, right? And so thinking about what the geoconvergence could do, it seems like there's a great opportunity of maybe working more closely with the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, which have been, pounded out over, collaborative process, mostly with government agencies, but specialists, thinking about how the SDGs are often gathered at the state level, the national level, but how would a geoconvergence help us understand things like inequality, and obviously sustainability, climate change? These are the things I think geoconvergence could really help inform, give us the real-time data, change over time data, and then also, apply that in meaningful policy venues. And then I guess in the other solutions areas, it is their sort of standardization or operability, all those terms. How do we get these different systems to connect and talk to one another? I think the cloud's going to be part of it, but setting up both standards of practice, standards of ethics, our standards of technology will be really important moving forward on this.
Yeah. The Q&A, Katie pointed out to me some of the Q&A. I mean, some of these are like dead on to some of the discussion, right? Josh Campbell, this is from Andrew Mongion. I'm probably slaughtering your name. I apologize. Josh Campbell brought this up at breakout yesterday. Do you teach a geographer to code, or do you teach a developer geography? Right? It's probably both and either. It seems that geography and the process of geoconvergence is losing its identity as a discipline. Geo is enabling, enhancing nearly every segment of innovation, but it seems to me that an expert in X with some comprehension of the value of geospatial thinking is better positioned to make an impact than expert geographer with some coding, mathematical, environmental exposure. I mean, I think the American Geographical Society resembles that remark. I mean, we appreciate that. We are, I think geography itself is in a process of redefinition, right? All of these fields of technology are really only from the past 50 years, while geography goes back, several thousand years to Eratosthenes, right? So, I think that's one of the reasons we're having a geoconvergence workshop, right? Is to try to figure out how to build a big tent that's open and lets everybody kind of appreciate the power of X, Y, Z, and T, regardless of the discipline they hail from, regardless of the field of practice that they feel committed to personally and professionally, regardless of the public mission or the sector of society that they're embedded in. We've been talking past each other because of those. Am I a geographer who can code, or a coder who can do geography? When in fact, we kind of need to have a common parlance for this new wave of innovation, this new wave of kind of colliding bodies of knowledge. Great question. I think
I'll just add that the American Geographical Society has been around since 1851. It had different sets of problems then, and certainly different technologies. But the way we understand ourselves today is to be the foremost champion of using geography to benefit society. So in the phrase I like, action geography, we see the geoconvergence as creating a set of tools, a platform that geographers will certainly contribute to, but many other disciplines and areas. And then from that platform, hopefully tackling some of the biggest global problems that are out there, climate change, inequality, sustainable systems. And these are going to be interdisciplinary collaborations. We have to cross sectors. We need to involve the private sector. We need to involve government and certainly academics and our students, train them to think big, boldly. But I'll just put in a plug in. Particularly, I think the last year and a half has showed us how pressing the problems of inequality are on the planet. And in November, the American Geographical Society will be convening virtually to conduct its Geography 2050 conference and address the topic of towards a more equitable future. And I think obviously geoconvergence is going to be fundamental in thinking about how we can get to a more equitable future, especially for the 7.5 billion people that are on the planet. Or I might be a little off there. Chris is tracking this now.
7.8 counting, Marie.
Oh my gosh.
I know.
List 300 million.
don't make me write another book about that. So I want to get two more questions out really fast because they're just great, right? Moving geoconvergence forward is going to require the development of coursework that uses this approach. In the past, the National Science Foundation has made it clear that GIS is not STEM, and therefore GIS-related education grants were rejected in STEM competitions. What are NSF's plans to provide a venue for geoconvergence educational grant proposals, if any? I have no idea. What I can say is the Convergence Accelerator as a rather new initiative that's based in the director's office, the director of NSF, has chosen geoconvergence as one of this year's 12 workshops that are being convened. What role this plays in NSF's strategy going forward is unclear, but I do think the communication channels are now open. We will take that question and bring it through our report forward to NSF. Because I've observed the same thing. Interestingly, geography, if you think about the unity of knowledge, right, and kind of history of thought, geography was, at the center of both natural philosophy and moral philosophy at the same time back in the day. And it's in that kind of disciplinary diaspora that, has happened. Everybody spread to the all the corners of the planet in their own corners and then started fighting. We still see, geography, the geoconvergence, what have you, as the intersection, not just of science, technology, engineering, and math, right? Remember, it started with like astronomy in order to do good geography back in the day, and a whole lot of trigonometry, but also the humanities and the social sciences. It's as human as it is about the physical and natural world. Back to Parag Khanna's kind of breakdown. Whether it's STEAM versus STEM, thank you, Bobby, for the note, or whether it's an interagency partnership between NSF and NEA, NEH, I have no idea. But I think I appreciate the question, and it'll certainly be part of our dialogue. And the next question from Megan Halabisky, which I may have said wrong. What are next steps to keep this geoconvergence conversation going? Great question. I love the idea, but in my field of remote sensing, I think the collaboration and application-focused research is not valued as much as it is here. Nice to have community to see value in this. What do you hope will come of this workshop? We hope it becomes a burning platform and a living burning platform for the community to rally around. If you have thoughts, if you are inspired by this, again, we encourage you to do a lightning talk and share your worldview. It is kind of coalescing that diversity of thought, diversity of experience, diversity of passion that we think is ultimately going to power the geoconvergence and bring down these barriers and enable more collaboration. The AGS is certainly invested in this for the long term. We're hoping National Science Foundation, they have a finite amount of resources and they have to prioritize based on a complex set of calculus that I have absolutely no insight into. But I do think this opens up a dialogue that's important. So, we are going to continue as AGS to be convening, additional events, probably not a 3-day death march event as we did to get this thing kicked off. But we also look forward to your ideas on what we could do. So make sure to email us. I believe it's geoconvergence@americangeo.org is still available. Or you can hunt me down at tucker@americangeo.org. And Katie is putting some links into the chat. So we would love to hear from you. If you think the remote sensing community as one kind of core group could benefit from this in a particular way, if only we took certain actions, please let us know. We'd love your ideas. So
we welcome you to join the American Geographical Society. We're not an exclusive group, as you can see. We play nicely with people across all different sectors. So American Geo is our website, and you can join and be a part of these conversations.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So if we could go to the next slide, Katie, I think I want to wrap things up. It is 12:30. I want to remind you, if you haven't done it already, use your cell phone, take a picture of this, point your camera at this QR code, provide us your feedback. Your thoughts are valuable. Your thoughts will be reflected in this final NSF report, maybe only as a sentence fragment or a phrase or a great neologism that you coined for us. But we would love to hear from you. Next slide. And there you go. Thank you. It's 12:30, right on time. I'm not sure if we did all we set out to do, but Marie, you were a great partner in crime.
As always, Chris, and special thanks to the staff at AGS who are working behind the scenes to make all this possible. You're a small group that has a mighty impact. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. And look, we'll keep sending out the links to this for YouTube if you want to send it around, day one YouTube if you want to send it around, and we'll make sure the final report is shared to everybody too. So be safe out there, take care, and stay in touch, please. Thanks so much.
Bye for now.